Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here in such large numbers. I'm somewhat overwhelmed and greatly honored. And it's great to see that history seems to still be relevant, and that you must believe in some ways that dealing with history helps us not just develop a better understanding of the past, but also to deal with some of the problems we are facing in the contemporary world. So it's really wonderful to see so many of you, and I'm very much delighted to be here. I very much want to thank the Godrej family for initiating this lecture series, for being such great stewards of India's economic and business history, and of course also for inviting me to be able to speak here today. And I also very much want to thank Vrunda for all her great work and her colleagues for making it possible for me to be here today. I think the preserving, I mean, this is not part of my formal talk, but since you just spoke about all the good work that you do about business history and archives, I think preserving this history is important on multiple levels. I mean, for one, it's important to a better understanding of the history of India, but beyond that, one great problem, and I'm going to talk about this in a little bit, one great problem of business history, economic history, the history of capitalism has been that it has been focused way too much on very few parts of the world. And preserving the record of entrepreneurs and economic actors and economic history in other parts of the world is important also to come to a new understanding, not just of the local history, but also of the global history. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So what I want to do today is exactly what is being advertised right here. I want to tell you about an empire, and it is not, as you might suspect, the British Empire, an empire that certainly has left a deep imprint on this city, nor is it something on the more informal American empire that structures a lot of the world today. Nor am I going to talk about empires of the very deep past, let's say the Mughal Empire or the Roman Empire or the Aztec Empire. Instead, I want to talk about an empire that is largely not remembered, that remained unheralded, but one that left nonetheless a powerful imprint on the history of the world, and in particular, as you probably all know, left a powerful imprint on the history and physical infrastructure and the design and architecture of this very city of Mumbai. And this, of course, is the Empire of Cotton. At first glance, that empire's emperor seems rather innocent and even inconsequential. It's a fluffy, white, and soft fiber growing on low bushes, spun into yarn, woven into cloth, and then printed, painted, and dyed. And if you have never touched cotton, I brought you a small bale of cotton, so I want to pass that around, but just make sure that I will get it back at the end, okay? I've managed to travel with this bale of cotton, literally to all corners of the world, and I've always gotten it back, so please return it by the end. That emperor seems certainly intriguing, but what role of consequence could it have possibly played in history? And how could that emperor ever have formed the kingdom that would come to dominate vast stretches of the surface of the earth and would come to draw millions into its orbit, as all proper empires, after all, have done? Even though it might seem unlikely to you, such an empire did emerge. And not only did such an empire form, it also became one of the most impactful empires of world history. As I will explain in a moment, Cotton's empire inaugurated the modern world in which we all live today, and its history, for better or for worse, the history of cotton illuminates core facets of one of the most important processes and most important histories in the human past during the past 500 years, and that is the emergence and development of capitalism. So I want to tell you about that empire of cotton this evening. And it might be best by stating at the outset that one of the core characteristics of that empire was its amazing geographic scope. It touched down on a remarkable number of locations in many different parts of the world, from centers of handicraft production in Gujarat to manufacturing cities such as Manchester, from cotton trading places such as Le Havre to cotton fields in places such as Brazil. In Mumbai, as well, that empire of cotton is very much, as you know, a local history. Indeed, in many ways, the city is a creation of the empire of cotton. And as most of you will know, since the early 19th century, Bombay has been India's cotton export center. It's cotton green, the place where hundreds of thousands of cotton bales changed hands in the 19th century. In 1860, for example, the city of Bombay alone handled 92% of all South Asian imports of cotton into the United Kingdom. And here you see a view of the cotton market in 1870. Bombay was also an important place where British imperial bureaucrats and British merchants worked to self-consciously recast India's position within the empire of cotton and thus within the global economy, away from its former dominance in world cotton trade, in manufactured cottons, and towards a subordinate position of supplying inexpensive raw cotton to world markets. And here's one of these examples of one of these British bureaucrats working on this project, but there are literally dozens, hundreds of them, if you go to the local library or to the Maharashtra State Archives right down the road. Bombay also has been one of the centers, as you know, of Indian industrialization, which, as elsewhere, began in the cotton textile industry. Banker Kobaji Davar and his associates floated the Bombay Spinning and Weaving Company as early as 1854. And indeed, India was one of the very early places that saw cotton industrialization, and he established the first cotton mill in Bombay. A boom in the textile industry followed, with 10 cotton mills set up in the city of Bombay in 1865, employing 6,500 workers. By 1900, that number had increased to a staggering 136 mills, created by people like Mr. Tata right here. The number of mill workers in Mumbai grew exponentially, climbing from 13,000 workers in 1875 to 76,000 workers in 1895, and then by the 1920s, 150,000 workers were employed in Mumbai's cotton industry. Mumbai remained an industrial stronghold way into the 1960s and 1970s, and its mills provided employment to approximately 1/4 of Mumbai's unionized workforce as late as the 1870s, and thus also played a very important role in the history of the Indian trade union movement. Indeed, the Bombay cotton industry saw the emergence of India's trade union movement just as much as it saw the emergence of an employers' association with the 1875 founding of the Bombay Mill Owners Association by Dinjor Petit. So deeply was Bombay connected to the empire of cotton that the 1861 American Civil War, which was fought many thousands of miles away from the shores of the Indian Ocean, had a decisive impact on the city's history. With the outbreak of that war in April of 1861, demand for Indian cotton grew tremendously on world markets, and exports of cotton from India tripled, allowing merchants in Bombay to make vast profits, which in turn drove up the Mumbai real estate market. If this sounds broadly familiar to today, then yes, that's perhaps a comparable situation. Which in turn, so it drove up the real estate market. That market then collapsed after the end of the American Civil War in 1865, which had devastating implications for the Bombay economy. But that shows again how deeply attached the Bombay economy was to the global cotton market. And last but not least, when India's freedom struggle gathered steam, cotton manufacturers played an important role, as did the very idea of cotton, with a central strand of Indians' critique of British colonialism, as you know, focused on its ill impact on the domestic cotton industry of India. It was certainly not a coincidence that Mahatma Gandhi pictured himself spinning cotton on a spinning wheel, and that the flag of the Indian National Congress had a spinning wheel at its center. These histories demonstrate that the history of the empire of cotton is extremely global in scope, but that here in Mumbai, that history is also very local. Its history is deeply entangled with all facets of the global empire of cotton. For someone like me, who has spent all too many years being obsessed with the history of cotton, there's hardly a better place to speak, and as we can also see here with the turnout being very good, there's hardly a better place for me to speak than in Mumbai. For me, being here is a bit like what it must feel for a scholar of Renaissance art to visit the city of Florence. In some ways, it all began here. So it's very good to be here today. And by the way, there is still some floor space here in the front. So if you feel like sitting on the floor, or here there's a podium, you should come up. It looks rather uncomfortable to stand there in the back. So feel free to come up. There's still some space if you want to sit down. So what I want to do in the next 40 minutes is exactly what has been advertised. Namely, I want to speak about the empire of cotton, and then see how that empire illuminates an issue we all care about, namely the issue of capitalism and its history. So if you don't care about cotton at all, it's fine. I'm also going to speak about something that I hope you care about, namely the history and the contemporary state of capitalism. As you know, this is a very big topic, both the empire of cotton as well as the history of capitalism. Indeed, it is so big that many scholars instinctively have stayed away from it. I still want to take that plunge, and I want to do so partly because of the contemporary urgency to deal with capitalism and its history, and partly because historians can contribute to these discussions on capitalism and its history in very distinct ways that I think will help us also see our contemporary dilemmas in a slightly different and new light. The urgency to think about capitalism is partly the result of the very fact that capitalist social relations have spread today into nearly all corners of the world and are constantly embracing ever more spheres of human life, a process that can be observed, I think, particularly well in a place such as India, where this process is occurring at a kind of accelerated speed. To understand the modern world, it seems clear, we need to come to terms with capitalism. And indeed, as you might know, during the past few years, there have been few topics that have animated more public discussions than the question of capitalism, a discussion that is very much to be welcomed. Latest since 2008, during the great economic crisis of 2008, it has become clear that to understand our contemporary world, we need to come to terms with capitalism. And also what speaks to the urgency of this issue is, as you remember, a few years ago, a French economist by the name of Thomas he published a book called Capital, which turned him into an academic superstar, and he sold millions of copies of this book, which speaks to the fact that there is a lot of interest trying to come to terms with contemporary capitalism. But our thinking about capitalism urgently needs the voice of historians. Capitalism has a history, even a very long history. The social and geographic expansion of capitalism is by now 500 years in the making, and the tendency of capitalism to revolutionize societies, technologies, states, as well as almost all aspects of our lives poses a great number of questions which I think can only be answered from a long historical perspective. And in that analysis, historians, I think, have certain advantages over economists, or at least some kinds of economists, not least because all too many economists have at times an unfortunate tendency to naturalize certain economic arrangements as if they are just like a fact of nature and have always been around, and then to search for the laws that explain this world, often with allegedly mathematical precision, a mode of thinking that fortunately is not commonly associated with the mode of thinking of historians. And in that way, business history is also fundamentally different, for example, from much of economic history being done by economists. If we instead study capitalism by looking at an important commodity such as cotton, we will immediately see the historical specificity of capitalism and also how it changed over time. We will never be able to know if capitalism could have developed differently than it did, let's say, for example, without colonialism. But we do know that cotton stood at the center of capitalism's history for an awfully long time. By looking at a commodity, by looking at the history of a thing, by looking at the history of cotton, we do not dissect the abstract nature of capitalism, but we can try through a detailed empirical analysis to understand the actual functioning of capitalism, or what I call capitalism in action. And as you will see in a moment, that capitalism in action often work quite differently from the capitalism you might encounter in your microeconomic or macroeconomic textbooks at college, which maybe some of you are reading right now, so, which can be quite dreadful. I remember that. Of course, both the history of cotton and the history of capitalism are subjects that have been explored by many historians. Thousands of books chart the development of cotton manufacturing industries in Europe and elsewhere, the history of cotton plantations in North and South America, the shifts within India's huge cotton and spinning and weaving sector, and the turn towards production of cotton for exports in West Africa, for example. But to truly understand the history of capitalism and the history of cotton, these diverse developments in many different corners of the world need to be connected to one another. They cannot just be told as separate stories, but we need to focus on how they all relate to one another. To understand cotton and to understand capitalism, we need to follow it from the farm and plantation to the merchant houses, to the factories, and then to final consumers. We need to follow it to the far corners of the world, to places such as Egypt and Argentina, to Brazil and India, England and Japan, the United States and China. Indeed, no part of this story can be understood without integrating it into a story that encompasses the entire world of cotton. The rise of slave plantations in the Americas growing cotton for world markets, for example, was directly related to the structure of agriculture in places such as central India, while in turn the severe challenges faced by India's cotton cloth export sector in the 19th century can only be fully understood if the vast exploitation of slave labor and the expropriation of the land of America's native peoples is also kept in view. Many such connections, often across vast geographical distances, characterize the empire of cotton and thus characterized also modern capitalism. And while it is certainly true that the global constrained the options available to local actors, it is also true that the local conditioned the global, and the local in many ways produced the global. So we can only think about the global, not just from a satellite perspective where we kind of keep the whole world in view at the same time, but in order to understand the global, we need to understand the local and how many different locals in their interaction produce the global world. And therefore, for example, the history of Mumbai in itself is very important to understanding the history of the empire of cotton. It is for these reasons that we need to take a decisively global perspective, but at the same time we need to show how local conditions, local struggles, and local preferences and local politics created the global. The history of cotton allows us to see with unusual clarity that the history of capitalism is in important ways about the connections forged between different places, different regimes of labor, and different kinds of states, so for example, empires. Indeed, looking at capitalism through the lens of the history of cotton makes it clear that our old attachment to national history is insufficient to understand that crucial part of our history, and that only a global perspective allows us to truly understand the empire of cotton, but also to understand capitalism. We need to start this exploration with the basic, but in the context of the discipline of history, nonetheless significant insight that in the end there is just one human history. and that its parts, the different parts of that human history, need to be understood within the whole, and that all parts, not just the ones that happen to have been privileged during the past 3 centuries, constitute the whole. Which is why Mumbai is just as much at the center of the history of the Empire of Cotton as the city of Manchester. The slave plantations of Mississippi are just as much at the center of the story as the factories of New England. And the history of the highly skilled artisans of Gujarat are just as much at the center of the story as the highly skilled artisans of Lancashire. But unfortunately, often when these stories are being told, the slaves of Mississippi, the artisans of Gujarat, and the entrepreneurs of Mumbai are completely ignored in the telling of that narrative. And so we need to look at the different sets of people. So for example, here, as we had seen before, the merchants in Mumbai. This is a textile industrialist from the 1820s in the beautiful city of Valladolid in the Yucatan, Mexico. Here you see cotton spinners in 1903 in Togo, cotton textile workers in the city of Nagoya in Japan, and here you see enslaved cotton cultivators in the United States. So we need to think about how all of their stories come together and how they together form the global empire of cotton, and how each of these stories informs all of the stories, and how they inform one another. But you might ask, why is looking at cotton a way to understand these problems and these questions? In a nutshell, to focus on cotton allows us to illuminate some important themes in modern history in general, and the history of capitalism in particular, because it was one of the most important commodities in the past 500 years. Yet most people in today's world hardly ever think about cotton. Cotton is familiar, to be sure, but this very familiarity makes it almost invisible. In some ways, cotton is like the air we breathe. We need it. It's really essential for us, but we never really think about it. And I think the cotton and the history of cotton is in a way very, very similar. We are surrounded by it at any moment of the day, but we hardly ever think, how do these things that we consume that are surrounding us, how do they come into being? Because the wonders of cotton seem so distant, only very few people know or can imagine that for about 900 years, that's a very long time, from the year 1000 to the year 1900, the growing, spinning, and weaving of cotton was the most important manufacturing sector that humans engaged in. And here you see, for example, cotton producers in what is now Mexico. In very large areas of the world, from Central Asia to East Africa, from Anatolia to India, a very large number of people kept themselves busy growing, spinning, and weaving cottons. Cotton was important to their local economies. It was one of the more important economic activities they engaged in, but it was also important to long-distance trade very early on, partly because cotton fabrics were valuable, they were relatively light, they kept well, and thus they could be transported over long distances. In many parts of the world, cotton served as a form of currency. You could take a piece of cloth and you could purchase other things for it. And indeed, in some parts of the world, such as China, for a long time, you could pay your taxes by giving the tax collector cotton cloth, which I hear now is not really possible in any part of the world any longer. Cotton became also important to myth-making and to religions. People in many different parts of the world, as you know, understood their fate to be either spun or woven. People across West Africa attributed to Anansi, a spider god, their skills in spinning and weaving cottons. Native people in North America, in what is now the United States, believed that one of the four sons of the ray of sunlight and daylight had created and planted cotton after he made the insects and the mountains. In Japan, people to this day pray to a god that symbolizes cotton. And as you know much better than myself, in Hindi scripture, cotton appears frequently and prominently. As these stories show, cotton was not just important to economic life, but also to social and religious lives in very large parts of the world throughout Asia, Africa, and North as well as South America. there was really only one part of the world, one significant part of the world, where cotton played almost no role. And that was, as you know, the continent of Europe. Europeans had remained marginal to the networks of cotton growing, manufacturing, and consumption for many centuries. Even after Europeans began importing small quantities of cotton cloth during Greek and Roman times, coming all the way from India to ancient Rome, ancient Athens, Europeans remained of little importance to the global cotton industry as a whole. Europeans dressed as they had for many millennia. They had largely dressed in linens and in woolens. And it was indeed Mahatma Gandhi who put it most starkly when he observed in a book that he wrote on the global history of cotton. He actually wrote a book on that as well. When he said that at a moment when India supplied Europe with its cottons, like in the 16th and 17th century, Europeans themselves, he said, were submerged in barbarism, ignorance, and a state of wilderness because they did not produce cottons. And in a way, being able to produce cottons was a sign of being civilized and advanced, also technologically advanced. Cotton, quite simply, was exotic to Europe. The fiber grew in faraway lands, such as in Anatolia, West Africa, and many Europeans reportedly imagined the cotton plant to look like this, a mixture of a plant and an animal, or what they called a vegetable lamb. Okay, so these lambs were supposed to bend down at night to drink, and somehow, then they were, somehow they produced the wool or the cotton, and that's how it came into being. And indeed, stories circulated in medieval Europe about these little sheep growing on plants and bending down at night to drink water. And as we all know, this is not how cotton is coming into being. Even if you have never seen a cotton plant, you presumably know that much. But that Europe was very much on the margins of this global empire of cotton. That was all about to change, at first in the 17th century rather slowly, but then by the end of the 18th century with enormous speed. Europe now, by the end of the 18th century, began to embark upon an industrial revolution. And this industrial revolution was one of the most important events ever in human history. And we need to pause for a moment to appreciate that this industrial revolution, this turning point in human history, really started with cotton. That's how important the empire of cotton is. But why? Why did it start with cotton? One of the core reasons for the importance of cotton to the Industrial Revolution was the basic fact that cotton already mattered tremendously in pre-industrial times. It was indeed that central importance of cotton before the Industrial Revolution that motivated European artisans to search for ways to drastically improve cotton production techniques. They did so because they knew that cotton fabrics, imported largely from India, were in high demand in Europe. So there was already a huge market for them. They also knew that cotton fabrics fueled the African slave trade. Indeed, most slaves on the west coast of Africa were purchased with cotton textiles, many of which were made in India. And it was clear to them that huge markets existed for what was, after all, the world's most popular textile fiber. Anyone who would be able to cater to this market and produce cotton fabrics in more productive and therefore cheaper ways would be able to gather enormous profits. Europeans were able to embark upon that adventure of Industrial Revolution partly because in the centuries before the Industrial Revolution, they had already succeeded in dominating many of the global cotton networks. They had expanded European power and trade into Asia, Africa, and the Americas. They traded in Indian fabrics, and they became ever more central in this particular trade. They purchased, as I mentioned, slaves on the west coast of Africa with Indian textiles. And they also had captured huge territories in the Americas that could be dedicated to cotton agriculture, also thanks to the availability of enslaved African labor. all factors that were exceedingly important to Europe's eventual domination of the world's cotton nexus. Indeed, it was Europeans' ability to recast global networks that was at the very core of the process of industrial revolution. Europeans had captured technologies and knowledge as well as a taste for cotton fabrics through the violent domination of Asian trade, and to some extent, so much less importantly, also the domination of production. Europeans had captured vast territories in North and South America that they began to turn into huge plantations that could help overcome Europe's resource constraints, including its limits on securing cotton. Europeans had come to forge a trade in African slave labor and had been able to organize this trade thanks to the ability to purchase slaves with Indian textiles. In the process, Europeans had built new kinds of institutions, from bills of exchanges to the Bank of England, from powerful navies to states with great taxing power, institutions that would become important to the cotton industry and to industrial capitalism more broadly. It was this often violent domination of global cotton networks that generated the possibility of industrial revolution, and thus for the great divergence in productivity and wealth and power that would come to structure the 19th century and beyond. But this is all prior to the technical innovations of the Industrial Revolution that you probably all have learned about in primary school or secondary school at some point. As a result of these conditions, the cotton industry was at the center of the Industrial Revolution that began in the 1780s. And once Europeans invented more productive ways of producing cottons, first in spinning, then in weaving, then in printing, that industry really took off. Lancashire, which became the core of that industry globally, for almost 200 years was a kind of Silicon Valley of the 19th century. Like anyone with some capital could go there and create a cotton factory and make enormous profits. Cotton had been important in many different parts of the world before the Industrial Revolution, as we just heard, but after the 1780s, it took on an unprecedented global dynamic. In Britain, it became the single most important manufacturing industry. Raw cotton was Britain's most important import product, and cotton cloth, often to India, was Britain's single most important export. In India, shifts within its huge cotton industry created tectonic upheavals in its domestic economy. For almost 5 millennia, that's a very long time, 5,000 years, India had stood at the center of global cotton manufacturing. Its artisans had produced the most exquisite cotton textiles, some so fine that Europeans compared the fabrics to what they called woven wind. But the emergence of factory production in Europe slowly undermined Indian export markets, and by the late 19th century, also increasingly the domestic market within India itself. And India came to specialize as a result increasingly on the export of raw cotton and not as before on the export of manufactured cotton textiles of the kind that you see here. This is really a gorgeous example. In continental Europe, cotton manufacturing everywhere became the first manufacturing industry, from Belgium to Italy, from France to Poland. Indeed, anywhere in the world where industrialization took place, it first took place in the cotton industry. Like in England, hundreds of thousands of cotton workers now streamed into these factories, most of them women and children. In the United States, raw cotton export established the young nation's place, which only had come about in the late 18th century, as it established the place of the United States in the global economy. Indeed, the United States mattered principally only to the global economy in the first half of the 19th century because it was by far the world's most important exporter of raw cotton, supplying more than 3/4 of the European market. And as you know, almost all of that cotton was grown by enslaved workers, and thus cotton effectively gave a new lease on life for one of the most exploitative systems of labor mobilization that had ever been invented, namely plantation slavery. And last but not least, throughout the world, ever more people began to use ever more cotton textiles, a change that became especially notable in areas that came late to cotton, such as the continent of Europe, where it now revolutionized how people dressed and how they kept clean. Okay, it was much easier to clean cotton fabrics, for example, than woolens, as you might know as well. Many more examples could be cited, but this should suffice to show that in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, cotton's importance was such that I think it can only be compared to the importance of oil to the history of the 20th century. The 19th century in particular was really a century of cotton. And while you might know some of that history, you might not know that today even cotton is still important. Last year, the world produced about 124 million bales of cotton, enough cotton to produce 20 t-shirts for every human being living on planet Earth. And since I don't think buy 20 t-shirts or the equivalent in other things, somebody else must buy many, many more. That's actually quite an amazing number, 20 t-shirts. If one would put these bales of cotton on top of one another, they would make a tower 64,000 kilometers high, about 40,000 miles high. Globally, it has been alleged that up to 350 million people today work in some ways in the world's cotton industry today, a number that has never been reached before in history and which represents between 3 and 4% of the entire human population. Huge cotton plantations can still be found around the world, from China to the United States, from West Africa to Central Asia. Indeed, a stunning 75 million acres of land are today used for the growing of cotton, which is exactly the equivalent of the surface area of the nation of Italy, the entire Italy, including all of its lakes, mountains, islands, all of it dedicated to cotton agriculture. And the raw fiber is still shipped to factories all around the world, where hundreds of thousands of workers spin and weave them and eventually turn them into clothing, such as in Bangladesh. The finished products are sold everywhere, from remote country stores to huge supermarkets such as Walmart or Carrefour. Indeed, cotton goods are among the very few goods that can virtually be acquired anywhere on planet Earth. And thus, cotton's history demonstrates the impressive and unprecedented increase in human productivity and human consumption that industrialization in particular and capitalism more generally have enabled. As an advertising campaign touted recently in the United States quite accurately, cotton, the fabric of our lives. So let me now come, I need some water. Let me now come to the second part of my presentation, namely to engage for a few minutes the question of how a cotton-centric view of history changes our understanding of the making of modern capitalism and thus the making of the modern world. And I will make 5 quick points, before I come to an end. For one, and most obviously, a cotton-centric view of the world suggests that we need to start with a much more global perspective to properly understand capitalism. The empire of cotton depended on the plantation, let's say in the United States, and the factory, the so-called core and the so-called periphery. Railroads and steamships ensured a global network of supply, transport, manufacture, and sale. It was only the combination of these different and even contradictory elements that led to the explosive growth of cotton in the 19th century. Just like today, when decisions made by Walmart, a very large American retailer, reverberate in far-flung places of the world, in the 19th century, the Liverpool Cotton Exchange had an enormous impact on Mississippi cotton planters. The Alsatian spinning mills were tightly linked to those of Lancashire, and the future of handloom weavers in New Hampshire or Bengal was related to such diverse factors as the construction of a railroad between Manchester and Liverpool, investment decisions by Boston merchants, or the tariff policies of the United States and Great Britain. Though nation states, as we will see in a moment, did matter, in channeling the trajectory of capitalism and of cotton, people forging cotton's history created networks, institutions, and processes that transcended any particular nation state or any particular empire. A cotton-centric history demonstrates through one powerful example that the global reach of capital is not ephemeral to the history of capitalism, but is its very essence. Capitalism from the outside was global in a way the earlier world had not been global. Capitalism emerged and built a world in which developments were connected across vast geographic distances, and capitalism was born global. That history of capitalism for all too long has been told as a Eurocentric story, and indeed perhaps one of the most Eurocentric stories of all. It has been told as a story that features places such as Florence, Amsterdam, or London, and their great and allegedly exceptional cultures, inventiveness, religious rationality, and institutions. Looking at the empire of cotton, however, shows that capitalism is really a global co-production, and that much of the stories we have told about capitalism during the past 200 years are radically limited, and indeed more an expression of the power relations in the world in which we live now than a persuasive reading of the actual history of capitalism. An analysis of the empire of cotton shows that the inventiveness of Indian cotton artisans and the business skills of 17th century Surat merchants is just as important to capitalism's history as the actions of their counterparts in places such as Lancashire and Amsterdam. And this brings me to the second argument, how a cotton-centric history provides a fresh understanding of the history of capitalism, namely that this interconnected world is not just very global, but at the same time it's very diverse, just like capitalism more generally. The growth in factories in 19th century Europe, for example, resulted in the reinvigoration of slavery in the United States. Booming cotton markets would push Native Americans off their land. Colonial holdings such as India were turned into raw material producers, and markets and merchants connected this extremely diverse world. In fact, a history of cotton helps us see not only the connections forged by capitalism, which we have talked about a lot now, but also, and most particularly, what I call its harnessing of contraries, of slavery on the one hand, and free labor on the other, markets and states, colonialism and free trade, industrialization in some parts of the world, and deindustrialization in other parts of the world. In some ways, cotton-focused history helps us see what I call the unity of the diverse, and argues that this very diversity of capitalism has been one of its core secrets of its success. Capitalism, in some ways, has always been what I call a connected diversity. And capitalism, unlike most of the people who write on it, is in itself rather undogmatic. It is, for example, not attached primarily to particular regimes of labor, but can connect very different kinds of labor with one another. And I think that exactly explains the dynamic of capitalism historically. Third, and directly related, looking at the history of cotton, as we see that when we try to understand capitalism, we need not only look at industry and at cities, but also and especially at the countryside and at agriculture. So this might not be popular opinion in the city of Mumbai, but I think it's still quite important. The countryside was, after all, an enormously important source of raw materials, of labor, and of markets. And a very large part of the history of capitalism deals with exactly that, how owners of capital and powerful states try to revolutionize the countryside and to integrate it into the global capitalist economy. And one important consequence of such a focus on the countryside is to see that slavery was of great importance to the history of capitalism. For all too long, many academics have seen slavery and capitalism as mutually exclusive systems of organizing economic activity. The history of capitalism was described as a history without slavery, and slavery was described as non-capitalist. Instead of describing slavery as it would unfold on the American cotton plantations as the modern institution that it really was, these scholars described it as pre-modern, violent to be sure, but unimportant to capitalist modernity, an unproductive system that put a brake on economic growth, a surviving artifact of an earlier world that was done away with by the very capitalist revolution. So capitalism is read as a system that overcomes the institution of slavery, which is not completely wrong, but I'm arguing here that at a certain crucial moment in the history of capitalism, slavery was actually quite central. Looking at the history of capitalism through the history of cotton, through the lens of the history of cotton, however, suggests that slavery was modern, profitable, expansive, and in some ways, it was at the very core of the expansion of industrial capitalism in England, the United States, and elsewhere, because it were enslaved workers who produced the most important raw material for industrial production, namely all that cotton. Indeed, slavery stood at the center of the most dynamic and far-reaching production complex that had ever been invented in human history up to this point. Nearly all cotton arriving in European cotton ports until the year 1861 was grown by slaves, and without the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans, the vast expansion of European cotton production, as well as the domination of the global cotton trade, and thus the very emergence of industrial capitalism, I think would have been difficult to envision. Fourth, the history of cotton demonstrates in impressive ways that globalization, which many people talk about today, is hardly the new development that is so often touted as today. Journalists and others get all too often way too excited about the newness of global economic connections. The history of cotton, however, clearly shows that global connections, often across vast distances, have a very long history and are quite at the core of the development of the global cotton industry and with it of global capitalism. Just think of the global cotton industry in the year 1830. British manufacturers accessed Asian technologies. They purchased American-grown cotton, tended by African-born labor, to produce cottons that they then sold into markets in all corners of the world. This is a strikingly modern arrangement. Indeed, we can see from the history of cotton not only that globalization is not new, it is also true that capitalism itself emerged from its very beginnings embedded within far-reaching and very global connections. And let me now come to my fifth, and you will be happy to hear, last argument about how a cotton-centric history changes how we understand important questions about the past. Looking at history through the lens of cotton also shows powerfully how much the actions of governments mattered to global economic development. It has become fashionable in some parts of the world, perhaps not in India, but in the United States, for example, it has become fashionable to see state intervention, to see the state as somehow contradictory to the unfolding of capitalism. And the argument is the more there's the state, the less there's capitalism, and the less there's a state, the more there's capitalism. But looked at from a long historical perspective, just the opposite is, I think, the case. States have played an enormously important role in the development of capitalism, certainly of Indian capitalism. States have protected industries from unwanted imports. For example, the textile industry in the United States in the 19th century. States have created legal systems that have helped mobilize workers. States have conquered distant markets. States have created infrastructures and have supported industries in many different ways. Indeed, when you look at a map of strong states and a map of states that industrialized early, these two maps are almost identical. One only has to think of Great Britain itself, that pioneer in mechanized cotton production, a powerful state in the 19th century which was in a nearly continuous state of warfare, necessitating very high levels of taxation, a state that got deeply involved in the affairs of its subjects, and a state that was definitely not democratic. That state also governed a huge empire, created barriers to the import of Indian cotton textiles, It forbade the export of its newfangled cotton manufacturing machines, and it also did not allow for the immigration of its skilled workers. In some ways, one could argue that the rise of cotton and the rise of capitalism is not only the result of the power of entrepreneurs, but also very much the result of the power of states. History suggests that we need to rethink in quite fundamental ways our conception of capitalism as not just a private, but also very much as a public project, a rethinking that has important implications for our thinking about the world today. So these are very big arguments for what, after all, is a relatively brief presentation. What I want you to take away from this short excursion into the fascinating world of cotton is that looking at something so banal and so common as cotton opens new views on some of the very biggest questions of our history, including the long history of capitalism. And cotton is particularly suited for such an investigation because no commodity played a comparably important role in forging the modern world, and especially the connections within that world. These global networks, as we have seen, shifted constantly, showing that the shape of the empire of cotton, the shape of capitalism, like everything else, is not a fact of nature, but a product of human agency, of human actions. Many narratives of history have the effect of dividing the world's people by searching for essential differences between them. Differences that are then almost presented as facts of nature, differences between rich parts of the world and poor parts of the world, citizens of the global south and citizens of the North Atlantic, white and black. Yet history is much more complicated. After all, only 150 years ago, it would have been unimaginable to a British colonial administrator sitting in the city of Calcutta, or to a Texan cotton farmer, or an Alsatian cotton manufacturer, that one day China would dominate the growing, spinning, and weaving of cottons. They could have imagined even less that India would be a major presence on world cotton markets again. And the possibility that that little island off the continent of Europe eventually would turn its remaining cotton factories into museums that might or might not entertain the children of unemployed former mill workers on one of these dreadful rainy weekends would have been only imaginable as an apocalyptic nightmare. Thank you.